Joe Abercrombie has a new book coming out. Yes, it is happening, and you better believe that I have read it. Now, I was really lucky to get an advanced reader's copy of The Devils, which officially hits the shelves in May. And this was honestly one of the coolest book mails I've ever received. And as a lifelong Abercrombie fan, I couldn't have been more excited. Now, Golan's, the publisher, not only sent me this really rare numbered copy of The Devils, which is signed and numbered, but they also sent me an additional box with additional goodies. So you can imagine Joe Abercrombie, the guy behind The First Law, The Heroes, Age of Madness, some of my all-time favorite series, and then receiving this really exclusive book led to my expectations being sky high. And let me just say this, while there is definitely a lot to enjoy in this book, it has a wild cast, clever dialogue, and that trademark grit, I must admit already now, it didn't quite come together in the way I had hoped. But don't be too disappointed yet, because I have very mixed feelings about this book. I both adored it and found it to be just okay. So let's talk about what worked, what didn't, and whether The Devils is worth picking up when it releases next month. So what is this book about? So this will be totally spoiler free, but let me just say this. So this is a part of a new series, so it's not part of the First Law universe, so you can actually start your Abercrombie journey with this book. So The Devils is set in a world divided by brutal holy war. On one side we have the Church of the West, and on the other we have the Church of the East. Now these powers are locked in this theological and political conflict, while an either greater threat looms on the horizon: the elves. And these aren't your elegant Tolkien-style elves. These are bloodthirsty, brutal, and ready for war kind of elves. Now, at the center of the story is Brother Diaz, a loyal member of the Church of the West, who thinks he's about to be rewarded with glory, only to be assigned to lead the notorious 13th Delegation, a group of outcasts known as the Devils. And they're on a dangerous mission into enemy territory. So his task is to escort a young woman named Alex, who just happens to be a secret princess, and he has to escort her into the East to reclaim her throne. And his allies, well, they're not exactly holy like he's trying to be. In this group, you have a cursed immortal who can't die, a vampire with serious aristocratic flair, a necromancer trying to get out of this assignment, a werewolf desperately trying to suppress her inner beast, and an elf that can turn invisible. And that's basically what this book is about. So I think I'm going to split this review into what I loved and what held this book back from being as good as Age of Madness, which I often say on this channel is one of the greatest series I have ever read. So the good, and I hope you actually don't just skip to the not so good section, because I hope to emphasize here that this is not a bad book, and I think that most of my audience will either enjoy or actually love this book. So let's start. First up, Abercrombie's prose is as smooth as ever. He just knows how to keep the pages turning. His dialogue is effortless, witty and sharp as always, and I think this is one of those rare books where the banter between the characters, it doesn't feel forced, it's clever, and I genuinely thought it was funny. To be honest, I don't think Abercrombie is able to write badly. He is just so ridiculously talented when it comes to prose, and that is why I love him as an author. There are very few authors I've ever come across that are able to write dialogue or craft scenes like Abercrombie, and this is still very much the case in this book. In some ways, it was a real joy to see Abercrombie take on a totally new series where he was able to try some new things with the characters and the plot, since he wasn't constrained to the First Law universe. And I think that one thing that is really famous with Abercrombie is his ability to write and craft interesting and compelling characters. And I also think that this is the case here. The characters and the cast is bursting with personality. In this book, Abercrombie takes this classic fantasy archetypes, like vampires, werewolves, necromancers, and gives them his own twisted flair. None of them, in my opinion, feel generic. Each of these characters has its quirks, secrets, and also a dark edge that makes them memorable. So for example, you got a cursed immortal who literally can't die, no matter what injuries he takes. Or we have a vampire who's all charm and has a lot of arrogance. Or this werewolf constantly trying and failing to keep the beast at bay. And there's so many other characters. And that is what makes this book memorable in so many ways. You have these generic fantasy archetypes, but they have these Abercrombie twists to them. They're all twisted in their own way, and they act differently than a normal elf or vampire would usually do. Another thing is that, in my opinion, a lot of Abercrombie's novels in the First Law universe are really light on these fantastical elements we often see in fantasy. And while this book is set in an alternative European setting, the characters here are truly fantastical and crazy, and I think a lot of readers will come to love them dearly. There are also several moments of brilliance throughout this book, scenes that are full of tension or that hit you with that sudden burst of Abercrombie's signature dark humor. So even if this book book didn't fully land for me as some of Abercrombie's other work. There were definitely times here where I thought, okay, this is why I keep reading Abercrombie, because as I've already kind of said, I don't think he's able to write a bad book. Now, the plot basically centers around this quest, right? To get this princess moved across Europe so she can claim her throne. So this is a take on the quest-based fantasy. So let me just make it clear. I generally don't enjoy overgeneralizing that I don't love this kind of trope or that kind of trope, because I think all tropes can be done well. That being said, I rarely love quest fantasy stories where the story revolves on getting someone from A to B. Obviously, some exceptions apply, like Lord of the Rings, but the best part of this story was actually the start of this novel. I think the first 50 to 100 pages here are really strong, and I felt super immersed and excited. We then go on this absolute crazy journey, and then towards the end, the plot settles a bit, and when we reach the last act, I actually started feeling really immersed again. So basically, I loved the parts where our cast wasn't directly traveling from A to B, but unfortunately, the traveling section is like 70% of the plot, and I thought that that section where we see these characters traveling was fine. I definitely think that many will love this book due to how unpredictable and very chaotic it is, but I just didn't feel overly immersed in the main section of the story, unfortunately. But I do also just want to insert here that I was actually revising for exams while reading this book, and I was super stressed about it, so it might very well be that if I read this book today, my enjoyment would have been so much higher. So there's so much to love here. The writing is brilliant, the plot is unique and absolutely crazy, and it has a lot of amazing moments, and I think that this book finishes quite strong, which is a reason why I'm planning on continuing this series. And as of recording this video, it has been more than a week since I finished this book, and it's still staying with me, which I think says a lot. Now, I know it's only been a bit more than a week, but you know, some books you read and you forget as soon as you almost finish them, but I feel like this book will actually stay with me for a while due to how unique and interesting it was. But let's talk about why I ultimately will not give this book 5 stars. So let's talk about pacing and plot, shall we? And yes, I know I've already touched on this in this video, but let's get into a bit more details. So I know I already mentioned this, but The Devils has this classic quest structure, where we follow characters moving from point A to B, facing obstacles along the way. And look, I know I already said it that I usually don't love the quest type kind of stories, but there are a lot of exceptions though. You know, I didn't really mind the travel heavy parts of Wheel of Time, which is one of my favorite series, or even Before They're Hanged by Joe Abercrombie, which is almost like famously a journey book, worked really well for me. I actually think that Before They're Hanged is probably my favorite book of the original First Law trilogy, but here in The Devils, I just don't know why, but it just felt a bit repetitive. This book has a lot of craziness and a lot of crazy battles, but for some reason, I just found them to be a bit stale. You know, the characters would arrive somewhere, deal with this challenge, and then the challenge would often be very Abercrombie-esque in how absurd and crazy it was. But then they would move on, and then it would kind of just repeat. And I just didn't feel like there was enough variation or forward momentum to keep it feeling fresh. And after a while, it just actually started to drag a bit for me. So that's why I mentioned that when we got to the last act, where this quest kind of takes a pause, I started loving the story again. Now, I recently watched Bookborn's review on this book, and she talked about the length of this novel, and I can't help but agree with her assessment when she talks about whether Abercrombie does enough to justify the length of the book, because this book is over 550 pages, and in my opinion, there just simply wasn't enough plot to justify its length. Obviously, a lot of things happen in this book, but in my opinion, they just didn't build in the most satisfying way. I don't know, it's a bit hard to pinpoint exactly what was lacking for me. But the second issue here was, in my opinion, character overload. I felt that this cast was massive, and while that can work, here it ended up feeling a bit fragmented. And this is probably what was most surprising to me, because I think that Abercrombie is probably the most talented character writer in the fantasy genre. So if anyone can pull a big cast, then it should be him. Let me reiterate, the characters individually are brilliant, but we're jumping between POVs a lot, and while each character is distinct and interesting, I just don't think we did spend enough time with any of them to get to see this meaningful growth we usually look for in our stories. Yes, the characters are funny, they are weird, they are Abercrombie-esque, but it really feels this plot would have benefited from maybe 2 less characters in my opinion. Now, my favorite character probably ended up being Sunny, this crazy elf, and I also thought that Brother Diaz was quite well realized. All the other characters characters were great, as I've already said, but it just felt like there's too many for the story Abercrombie was trying to tell here. So, what is my final rating, and will I recommend this novel? Well, if you only judge this book by the start and the finish of this book, I probably would have given this book 4.5 stars or even 5 stars because I loved the start and ending. Let me make it clear, there are so many fantastic elements in this book, and I will definitely continue the series. But I think as a whole, I think that this is probably a solid 3.5 star read for me. Abercrombie doesn't know how to write a bad book, in my opinion, and for a book that I think is probably one of his weaker novels compared to a lot of his other work, it is still brilliant compared to most of the books in the modern fantasy era. So I really hope you will give this book a try, because even though it is not perfect, I do genuinely look forward to book 2. And at the end, I just want to give a special thanks to all my Patreon who continue to support me. I really, really appreciate it, and I couldn't run this channel without you, so thank you so much.